Mr. Chairman and gentlemen of the convention.
And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe.
Hey guys, welcome. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome back to part 2 today of our look at the great statesman Henry Clay. Of course, this is our presidential and vice presidential candidate slash losers series that we're doing. People who ran for the office of president or vice president and didn't win. They never won the election. So they came up short. So it's a very cool, fun, interesting series. Yesterday, of course, part 1, we took a look at Henry Clay's early life. Born in Virginia, eventually made his way to Lexington, Kentucky. He was an attorney, and then he became involved in politics. And this great statesman from the state of Kentucky was born, so to speak. So we took a look at all that yesterday in part 1. I hope you enjoyed it. And now today in part 2, we're going to take a look at his time in politics and basically all of the elections that he ran in and came up short in. There's several of them. So we're going to take a look at all that and then take a look at his later life and then, of course, his death, because that's what we do here at Dead History. So sit back. It's going to be great. Make sure to give us a like, a thumbs up. Leave all those comments and questions. And, of course, hit the subscribe button. Definitely appreciate those of you who leave us comments and like us and subscribe. We appreciate all of you. Also, real quick, another thing that would be great, if in the comments, if you guys want to give us suggestions on people that you would like to see us cover in this series, please let us know. Now listen, I have about 3 or 4 other people beside, of course, Henry Clay that I know for a fact we're going to do. Henry and I are going to cover those people. There's probably about 4 of them. But that still leaves plenty of time, plenty of weeks here until the start of the new year for us to cover people that maybe you suggest. So if I get some suggestions from our audience and I see there's a trend of there's certain people that you guys are suggesting a lot, maybe we'll cover those people. So just keep that in mind to comment down below. All right, let's go. Let's get right into this. Henry Clay, part 2. Here we go. Burned deeply into Henry Clay's psyche was a yearning to be President of the United States. He made his first gamble for this office in 1824 with only a remote chance of winning. In 1832, he once again attempted to be elected president, and he suffered his most disappointing loss for the office in 1844. In 1822, several members of the Democratic Republican Party had become exploring presidential bids to succeed President James Monroe, who planned to retire after 2 terms like his predecessors. As the Federalist Party was near collapse, the 1824 presidential election would be contested only by members of the Democratic Republican Party, including Henry Clay. Having led the passage of the Tariff of 1824 and the General Survey Act, Henry Clay campaigned on his American system of high tariffs and federal spending on infrastructure. 3 members of James Monroe's cabinet, Secretary of the Treasury William Crawford, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, and Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, appeared to be Henry Clay's strongest competitors for the presidency. Though many, including Clay, did not take his candidacy seriously at first, General Andrew Jackson emerged as a presidential contender, eroding Clay's base of support in the western states. In February of 1824, the sparsely attended Democratic-Republican Congressional Caucus endorsed Crawford's candidacy, but Crawford's rivals ignored the caucus results, and various state legislatures nominated candidates for president. During the campaign, Crawford suffered a major stroke, while Calhoun withdrew from the race after Jackson won the endorsement of the Pennsylvania legislature. By 1824, with Crawford still in the race, Henry Clay concluded that no candidate would win a majority of electoral votes. In that scenario, the House of Representatives would hold a contingent election to decide the election. Under the terms of the 12th Amendment, the top 3 electoral vote getters would be eligible to be elected by the House. Henry Clay was confident that he would prevail in a contingent held in the chamber he presided over, so long as he was eligible for election. Well, Henry Clay won Kentucky, he won Ohio, and he won Missouri. But his loss in New York and Louisiana relegated him to a 4th place finish behind Adams, Jackson, and Crawford. Clay was humiliated that he finished behind the invalid Crawford and Jackson, but supporters of the 3 remaining presidential candidates immediately began courting his support for the contingent election. For various reasons, supporters of all 3 candidates believed they had the best chance of winning Clay's backing, but Clay quickly settled on supporting Adams. Of the 3 candidates, Adams was the most sympathetic to Clay's American system, and Clay viewed both Jackson and the sickly Crawford as unsuitable for the presidency. On January 9th of 1825, Henry Clay privately met with Adams for 3 hours, after which Clay promised Adams his support. Both would later claim that they did not discuss Clay's position in an Adams administration. With the help of Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams won the House vote on the first ballot. After his election, Adams offered Clay the position of Secretary of State, which Henry Clay accepted, despite fears that he would be accused of trading his support for the cabinet post. Jackson was outraged by the election, and he and his supporters accused Clay and Adams of having reached a corrupt bargain. Pro-Jackson forces immediately began preparing for the 1828 presidential election, with the corrupt bargain accusation becoming their central issue. So there you have it, Henry Clay's first attempt at, running for president, and of course falling short in the 1824 presidential election. But now, under John Quincy Adams, President John Quincy Adams, he's now, Henry Clay that is, Secretary of State. So let's learn a bit about his time as Secretary of State. Henry Clay served as Secretary of State from 1825 to 1829. As Secretary of State, he was the top foreign policy official in the John Quincy Adams administration. But he also held several domestic duties, such as oversight of the Patent Office. Clay came to like Adams, a former rival, and to despise Jackson. They developed a strong working relationship. Adams and Clay were both wary of forming entangling alliances with the emerging states, and they continued to uphold the Monroe Doctrine, which called for European, non-intervention in former colonies. Clay was rebuffed in his efforts to reach a commercial treaty and a settlement of the Canada-United States border with Britain, and was also unsuccessful in his attempts to make the French pay for damages arising from the attacks on American shipping during the Napoleonic Wars. He had more success in negotiating commercial treaties with Latin American republics, reaching most favored nation trade agreements in an attempt to ensure that no European country had a trading advantage over the United States. Seeking deeper relations with Latin American countries, Clay strongly favored sending American delegates to the Congress of Panama, but his efforts were defeated by opponents in the Senate. Adams proposed an ambitious domestic program based in large part on Clay's American system. But Clay warned the president that many of his proposals held little chance of passage in the 19th Congress. Adams' opponents defeated many of his proposals, including the establishment of a naval academy and a national observatory. But Adams did preside over the construction or initiation of major infrastructure projects like the National Road and the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. Followers of Adams began to call themselves National Republicans, and Jackson's followers became known as Democrats. Both campaigns spread untrue stories about the opposing candidates. Adams' followers denounced Jackson as a demagogue, and some Adams-aligned papers accused Jackson's wife Rachel of bigamy. Though Henry Clay was not directly involved in these attacks, his failure to denounce them earned him the lifelong enemy of Jackson. Henry Clay was one of John Quincy Adams' most important political advisors, but because of his myriad responsibilities as Secretary of State, he was often unable to take part in campaigning. As Adams was averse to the use of patronage for political purposes, Jackson's campaign enjoyed a marked advantage in organization, and Adams' allies such as Clay and Daniel Webster were unable to create an equally powerful organization headed by the president. In the 1828 election, Jackson took 56% of the popular vote and won almost every state outside of New England. Henry Clay was especially distressed by Jackson's victory in Kentucky. The election result represented not only the victory of a man Clay viewed as unqualified and unprincipled, but also a rejection of Clay's domestic policies. It really is quite interesting because, Henry Clay, of course, he ran for president, didn't win. John Quincy Adams won, made him Secretary of State. Him and Adams, began to have a very good working relationship. And he always had this disdain for Andrew Jackson, and Andrew Jackson always had this disdain for Henry Clay. And then, of course, Jackson wins the election and becomes president. And now Henry Clay's kind of stuck in limbo, so to speak. So, yeah, it's very interesting. So now, we got to learn about where Henry Clay went from here. What did he do? So that's what we're going to discuss now. Even with Henry Clay out of office, President Andrew Jackson continued to see Clay as one of his major rivals, and Jackson at one point suspected Clay of being behind the Petticoat Affair, a controversy involving the wives of his cabinet members. Clay strongly opposed the 1830 Indian Removal Act, which authorized the administration to relocate Native Americans to land west of the Mississippi River. Another key point of contention between Clay and Jackson was the proposed Maysville Road, which would connect Maysville, Kentucky to the National Road in Zanesville, Ohio. transportation advocates hoped that later extensions would eventually connect the National Road to New Orleans. Henry Clay returned to federal office in 1831 by winning election to the Senate over Richard Mentor Johnson in a 73-64 vote of the Kentucky legislature. His return to the Senate after 20 years, 8 months, and 7 days out of office marks the fourth longest gap in service to the chamber in history. With the defeat of John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay became the de facto leader of the National Republicans, and he began making preparations for a presidential campaign in the 1832 election. In 1831, Andrew Jackson made it clear that he was going to run for re-election, ensuring that support or opposition to his presidency would be a central feature of the upcoming race. Jackson's Democrats rallied around his policies towards the national bank, internal improvements, Indian removal, and nullification. But these policies also earned Jackson various enemies, including Vice President John C. Calhoun. However, Henry Clay rejected overtures from the fledgling anti-Masonic Party, and his attempt to convince Calhoun to serve as his running mate failed, leaving the opposition to Jackson split among different factions. Inspired by the anti-Masonic Party's national convention, Clay's National Republican followers arranged for a national convention that nominated Henry Clay for president. So now this is the second time that Henry Clay has ran for president, the 1832 election. And as the 1832 election approached, the debate over the reauthorization of the national bank emerged as the most important issue in the campaign. Basically, Andrew Jackson disliked the national bank because of a hatred of both banks and paper currency. So that was like the big thing here. Henry Clay had initially hoped that the national bank re-charter that took place would work to his advantage, but Andrew Jackson's allies seized on the issue, redefining the 1832 presidential election as a choice between the president and a moneyed oligarchy. Ultimately, Henry Clay was unable to defeat a popular sitting president. Andrew Jackson won 219 of the 286 electoral votes and 54.2% of the popular vote, carrying almost every state outside of New England. So then there was the nullification crisis. The high rates of the tariff of 1828 and the tariff of 1832 angered many Southerners because they resulted in higher prices for imported goods. So a lot of different things went on regarding the nullification crisis. South Carolina was involved, and I'm not going to go into all the specifics of the tariffs. However, Henry Clay, although he favored the high tariff rates, he thought that Andrew Jackson's strong rhetoric against South Carolina distressing and sought to avoid a crisis that could end in civil war. So basically, Jackson was trying to put on these tariffs and stuff that were going to really affect South Carolina. And of course, we know South Carolina was threatening to secede from the Union and all that kind of thing. So what happened was Henry Clay proposed a compromise tariff bill that would lower tariff rates, but do so gradually, thereby giving manufacturing interests time to adapt to less protective tariffs. Clay's compromise tariff won the backing of both manufacturers who believed they would not receive a better deal and John C. Calhoun, who sought a way out of the crisis but refused to work with the president and President Jackson's supporters on an alternative tariff bill. And though most members of Clay's own National Republican Party opposed it, the tariff of 1833 passed both houses of Congress. Jackson simultaneously signed the tariff bill and the force bill, and South Carolina leaders accepted the new tariff, effectively bringing the crisis to an end. Henry Clay's role in resolving the crisis brought him renewed national stature in the wake of a crushing presidential election defeat, and some began referring to Henry Clay as the Great Compromiser. So now, basically the formation of the Whig Party. I'm not going to get in again to all the specifics, but basically following the end of the nullification crisis in March of 1833, Andrew Jackson basically took up offense and went against the National Bank again. And despite some opposition, even in his own cabinet. And basically what they did was they pursued a policy of removing all federal deposits from the National Bank and placing them in state-chartered banks. They were kind of known as, the term was pet banks. So the removal of deposits helped unite Andrew Jackson's opponents into one party for the first time. And as National Republicans, Calhounites, former Democrats, and members of the anti-Masonic Party coalesced into what became known as the Whig Party. And the term Whig originated from a speech that Henry Clay delivered in 1834, in which he compared opponents of Jackson to the Whigs, a British political party opposed to absolute monarchy. Neither the Whigs nor the Democrats were unified geographically or ideologically. So they didn't have the same ideology, they weren't in the same general area, geographically. It was all over the place. However, the Whigs tended to favor a stronger legislature, a stronger federal government, a higher tariff, greater spending on infrastructure, reauthorization of the Second Bank of the United States, and publicly funded education. And conversely, Democrats tended to favor a stronger president, stronger state governments, lower tariffs, hard money, and expansionism. And neither party took a strong national stand on slavery. The Whig base of support lay in wealthy businessmen, professionals, the professional class, and large planters, while the Democratic base of support lay in immigrant Catholics, farmers, but each party appealed across class lines. And partly due to grief over the death of his daughter Anne, Henry Clay chose not to run in the 1836 presidential election, and the Whigs were too disorganized to nominate a single candidate. So 3 Whig candidates ran against Martin Van Buren, which was General William Henry Harrison, Senator Hugh Lawson White, and Senator Daniel Webster. By running multiple candidates, the Whigs hoped to force a contingent election in the House of Representatives. And Henry Clay personally preferred Webster, but he threw his backing behind Harrison, who had the broadest appeal amongst voters. Henry Clay's decision not to endorse Webster opened a rift between the 2 Whig Party leaders, and Webster would work against Clay in future presidential elections. And despite the presence of multiple Whig candidates, Martin Van Buren won the 1836 election. So, and Martin Van Buren's presidency was not good. It really wasn't. It was affected definitely by the Panic of 1837, a major recession that badly damaged the Democratic Party. Henry Clay and other Whigs argued that Andrew Jackson's policies, including the use of those pet banks, had encouraged speculation and caused the panic. Clay promoted the American system as a means for economic recovery, but President Martin Van Buren's response focused on the practice of strict economy and frugality. So now, as the 1840 presidential election approached, many people expected that the Whigs would win control of the presidency due to the ongoing economic crisis. Henry Clay initially viewed Daniel Webster, as his strongest rival, as we had said before, but Henry Clay, Harrison, and General Winfield Scott emerged as the principal candidates at the 1839 Whig National Convention. And although Henry Clay was widely regarded as the most qualified Whig leader to serve as president, many Whigs questioned Clay's electability after 2 presidential election defeats. Clay also faced opposition in the North due to his ownership of slaves and lingering association with the Freemasons, and in the South from Whigs who distrusted his moderate stance on slavery. Henry Clay won a plurality on the first ballot of the Whig National Convention, but with the help of Thurlow Weed and other backers, Harrison consolidated support on subsequent ballots and won the Whig presidential nomination on the 5th ballot of the convention. Seeking to placate Clay's supporters and to balance the ticket geographically, the convention chose former Virginia Governor and Senator John Tyler, who was a personal friend of Henry Clay's, and whose previous career in the Democratic Party had practically come to an end as the vice presidential nominee. John Tyler, that is. Henry Clay was disappointed by the outcome, but he helped Harrison ultimately successful. It was a successful campaign by delivering numerous speeches. With Whigs also winning control of Congress in the 1840 elections, Henry Clay saw the upcoming 27th Congress as an opportunity for the Whig Party to establish itself as the dominant political party by leading the country out of recession. President-elect William Henry Harrison asked Henry Clay to serve another term as Secretary of State, but Clay chose to remain in Congress. Webster was instead chosen as Secretary of State, while John J. Crittenden, a close ally of Clay, was chosen as Attorney General. As Harrison prepared to take office, Clay and Harrison clashed over the leadership of the Whig Party, with Harrison sensitive to accusations that he would answer to Clay. And of course, as we know, history of course tells us that William Henry Harrison, shortest presidency in history, he dies, and his vice president John Tyler takes over, which is obviously the first time that we ever saw something like this happen in our country's history. And John Tyler was a disaster. He just simply was. He really did not stand for much of anything. The only thing he really did stand for was his very, very strong slavery beliefs. And I don't mean that he was a slave owner and someone who thought that slavery should be allowed. He wanted more slavery. He was really that radical when it came to the issue of slavery, and he was just a disaster. He just really was. So his presidency was not good. But then we're starting to get into the end of that, the Tyler presidency, and here we go. We're getting close to the 1844 presidential election. Now this is the election of 1844 that really crushed Henry Clay. You have to remember, Henry Clay is a man that dealt with a lot of personal tragedy and personal loss in his life. Obviously, his daughters, several of them died very young. Then the rest of them died very early in motherhood, like during birth. And his one son was killed in war. His other son was, sent to an asylum. He just had a lot of really tragic things happen in his personal family life. So he was kind of a sad figure in that way in history. Now, here it is, the 1844 presidential election. This man has already ran for president 2 times and lost. He tried to run again and wasn't nominated by his party. He was not the candidate by his party that his party chose. So here he is now, like a 3rd to 4th time trying to run for president, and this is the election in 1844 that truly just ripped the heart out of his chest, so to speak. So we're going to go over that now. The 1844 presidential election. President John Tyler's break with the Whig Party, combined with Webster's continuing affiliation with Tyler, positioned Henry Clay as the leading contender for the Whig nomination in the 1844 presidential election. By 1842, most observers believed that Henry Clay would face Martin Van Buren in the 1844 presidential election, as he had still remained as the clear leader of the Democrats and, following the tradition of the founders, wanted a second term. Hoping to win another term, President Tyler forged an alliance with John C. Calhoun and pursued the annexation of the Republic of Texas, which would add another slave state to the Union. After President Tyler concluded an annexation treaty with Texas, Henry Clay announced his opposition to annexation. He argued that the country needed union, peace, and patience, and annexation would bring tensions over slavery and war with Mexico. The same day that Clay published a letter opposing the annexation of Texas, Martin Van Buren also came out against annexation, citing similar reasons as Clay, so that slavery and especially expansionism seemed to play no role in the next election. Henry Clay unanimously won the presidential nomination at the 1844 Whig National Convention, but a minority of expansionist Southern Democrats, encouraged by Tyler's alternative outline, blocked Van Buren's nomination at the 1844 Democratic National Convention for countless ballots, until Van Buren withdrew, making place for an unexpected compromise candidate. The party nominated former Speaker of the House, James K. Polk of Tennessee, who favored annexation, but in order to calm anti-expansionists, promised to just run for a single term. Following the nomination of a pro-annexation Democrat, Tyler soon ended his incipient independent run for president, and he endorsed Polk. Henry Clay was surprised by Martin Van Buren's defeat, but remained confident of his chances in the 1844 election. Polk was the first dark horse presidential nominee in U.S. history, and the Whigs mocked him as a fourth-rate politician. Despite his relative lack of national stature, Polk proved to be a strong candidate capable of uniting the factions of the Democratic Party and winning the support of Southerners who had been reluctant to support Van Buren. Clay's stance on slavery alienated some voters in both the North and the South. Pro-slavery Southerners flocked to Polk, while many Northern abolitionists who tended to align with the Whig Party favored James G. Birney of the Liberty Party. Clay's opposition to annexation damaged his campaign in the South, as Democrats argued that he worked in unison with the Northerners to stop the extension of slavery. In July, Henry Clay wrote 2 letters in which he attempted to clarify his position on the annexation of Texas, and Democrats attacked his supposedly inconsistent position. James K. Polk narrowly won the election, taking 49.5% of the popular vote and 170 of the 275 electoral votes. Birney won several thousand anti-annexation votes in New York, and his presence in the race may have cost Clay the election. Most of Henry Clay's contemporaries believed that annexation had been the decisive issue in the race, but Polk's savvy campaigning on the tariff may have also been decisive, as he narrowly won pro-tariff Pennsylvania after downplaying his anti-tariff views. After Polk's victory and the final indirect success of Tyler's strategy, Congress approved the annexation of Texas, which was signed by Tyler on his last day in office, and Texas gained statehood in late 1845. After the 1844 election, Henry Clay returned to his career as an attorney. Though he was no longer a member of Congress, he remained closely interested in national politics. In 1846, the Mexican-American War broke out after American and Mexican forces clashed at the disputed border region between Mexico and Texas. Initially, Henry Clay did not publicly oppose the war, but privately he saw it as an immoral war that risked producing some military chieftain who will conquer us all. And Henry Clay suffered a personal blow in 1847 when his son, Henry Clay Jr., died at the Battle of Buena Vista. In November of 1847, Henry Clay reemerged on the political scene with a speech that was harshly critical of the Mexican-American War and President Polk. He attacked Polk for fomenting the conflict with Mexico and urged the rejection of any treaty that added new slave territory to the United States. By 1847, General Zachary Taylor, who commanded the American forces at Buena Vista, had emerged as a contender for the Whig nomination in the 1848 presidential election. Despite Taylor's largely unknown political views, many Whigs believed he was the party's strongest possible candidate due to his martial accomplishments in the Mexican-American War. One of Henry Clay's most trusted allies and advisors, John J. Crittenden, was Taylor's de facto campaign manager. Clay had initially told his allies that he would not run in the 1848 presidential election, but he was unwilling to support Taylor, a mere military man. However, on April 10th of 1848, Henry Clay announced his candidacy for the Whig nomination. Although Webster and Winfield Scott each commanded a limited base of support in the party, Taylor and Clay each saw the other as their lone serious rival for the Whig nomination. As Taylor commanded the support of most Southern Whigs, Henry Clay focused his efforts on courting Northern Whigs, emphasizing his opposition to the Mexican-American War and his lifelong support for the gradual emancipation of slaves in Kentucky. Clay presented a strong challenge to Taylor at the 1848 National Whig Convention, but Taylor won the presidential nomination on the fourth ballot, partially in an attempt to pleased the Clay wing of the party, the convention nominated Millard Fillmore as Taylor's running mate. Clay was embittered by his failure at the convention, and he did not campaign on behalf of Taylor. But nonetheless, Zachary Taylor won the election. Increasingly worried about the sectional tensions arising over the issue of slavery in newly acquired territories, Henry Clay accepted election to the Senate in 1849. Having refused to campaign for Taylor, Clay played little role in the formation of Taylor's cabinet or in determining the new administration's policies. And during this time, Henry Clay proposed a compromise designed to organize territory acquired in the Mexican-American War and address other issues contributing to sectional tensions. So during all this time, of course, now President Zachary Taylor dies in office. He died unexpectedly. So after Taylor's death, President Fillmore, who supported Clay's compromise bill, consulted with Henry Clay in appointing a new cabinet. Exhausted by the debate in the Senate, Henry Clay took a leave of absence shortly after Zachary Taylor's death. But the proposal, the compromise, continued on. And by the end of September of 1850, it was Henry Clay's proposal, which became known as the Compromise of 1850, that had been enacted. And even though people like Fillmore, Douglas, Webster, all these people were very, integral parts of the compromise, Henry Clay was still widely regarded as the key figure in ending a major sectional crisis. Now, I'm just going to read some stuff about Henry Clay, just kind of an overview of him as a statesman, even though we've kind of covered this stuff, just an overview. And then I'm going to get into his kind of very contentious relationship and very interesting things on slavery with Henry Clay. From the birth of the American Republic in 1789, deep differences between North and South, coupled with westward expansion, nearly plunged the nation into civil war in 3 separate crises before guns opened up upon Fort Sumter on April 12th of 1861. Each time, one man, one statesman, forged a compromise. That statesman was Henry Clay of Kentucky. Early in his life, Henry Clay came to Kentucky and was elected to Congress. A war hawk, Clay evolved into a diplomat, negotiating the Treaty of Ghent, ending the War of 1812, and soon thereafter, Clay was elected to the United States House of Representatives. With the petitioned statehood of Missouri in 1820, the nation faced its first crisis over whether to admit a state from the Louisiana Purchase as a free state or a slave state. Speaker of the House Henry Clay diffused the crisis by crafting the Missouri Compromise, deemed by former President Thomas Jefferson as a fire bell in the night. A second time in the 1830s, sectional strife flared up as the post-war of 1812 tariff brought cries of nullification and even secession from South Carolina. After months of rising threats of civil war, Senator Henry Clay introduced the Compromise of 1833, averting disunion and bloodshed. Nearly 20 years later, the admission of California as a slave or free state was at stake. And no time in its history had the American Republic been brought so close to civil war, facing a situation seemingly beyond compromise. But for a third time, Senator Henry Clay skillfully fashioned a compromise, the Compromise of 1850, staving off a bloody civil war for more than a decade. Henry Clay was indeed the great compromiser, the great pacificator. Abraham Lincoln regarded Henry Clay as the greatest legislator the nation had ever produced, calling him my Beau, ideal of a statesman. Without question, Henry Clay's ideals of statesmanship and compromise continue to be relevant and necessary in today's increasingly turbulent and divided world. So now I'm going to discuss Henry Clay and slavery. Now listen, like I've told you guys many times on these videos, the reality of the history of America, of American history, is we have to look at everything. And I think the most important thing you can do as, I don't know, whether you want to call me a historian or not, like I said, I'm not a formally educated historian, but anybody that enjoys history or discusses it or has a platform like I do to bring history to light to some people, you have to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there's nothing uglier and more heinous in the history of America than slavery. It is literally the biggest sin that our country has ever bestowed upon itself. It's ugly, it's nasty, it's disgusting. And Henry Clay was a slave owner. I mean, that's what it comes down to. Henry Clay was a truly incredible statesman. He was an accomplished politician, an accomplished attorney. He was a very brilliant man. He was a very, very important part of American politics for decades. There's no disputing that Henry Clay he shaped and formed some of the most important times and policies and compromises, as he was known, in our history. But I have to bring up the plain simple fact that Henry Clay was a slave owner. And Henry Clay, even though he did see the evils of slavery, and he saw that it was not a good thing, the question really is, did he do much about it? And that is what I'm going to bring to light here, and you can make your own judgment. I know how I feel regarding Henry Clay with slavery. Like many people of his time, they may not have thought it was a good idea moving forward. They may have thought it was terrible, but there really wasn't much done about it. So here we go. The defining issue of Henry Clay's time and of his career was slavery. While his personal and political views often seemed contradictory, his actions rarely were. While Clay never believed in the equality of the races, he did say that slavery was wrong. He called it a curse on the master and a grievous wrong on the slave. He said that slaves were rational beings. In the 1830s, he wrote a friend that slavery is unjust and a great evil are undisputed axioms. The difficulty always has been how to get rid of it. He wrote publicly of his support for gradual emancipation. These views remained somewhat unchanged throughout his life. But ultimately, these sentiments proved hollow. As Henry Clay became a landowner and ever wealthier, his views shifted. He seemed to decry slavery while continually buying, selling, and owning human beings. People would call him a hypocrite. While it is likely that Clay had an internal struggle with the institution of slavery, time after time, Henry Clay chose to maintain and uphold it. He had supported colonization, the transporting of freed black Americans to Liberia. Henry Clay believed that they should go to the land of their father, Africa. He was actively engaged in the organization that enabled this process, the ACS, the American Colonization Society. Yet, he only emancipated 7 of his enslaved people, and he colonized none of them. Henry Clay engineered 3 compromises to keep the Union together. He is famously known as the Great Compromiser. The compromises dealt with the expansion of the young nation and slavery's place in it. The compromises spelled out where slavery could exist and under what terms. The compromises are generally credited with delaying civil war long enough that the Union could prevail and emerge intact. Unfortunately, the compromises did nothing for the enslaved, and in some ways made their lives harder. Consider the Compromise of 1850. One of the pieces of that legislation was the strengthening of the Fugitive Slave Act, which required that slaves be returned to their owners even if they were in a free state. Henry Clay was wrong that the compromises would prevent civil war because he failed to grasp a fundamental reality. The enslaved could be viewed as people or as property, but not both. There was no middle ground. There were collateral damage. Henry Clay saved the Union for a time, but not the enslaved. As he lost one presidential campaign after another, 3 in total, Henry Clay always maintained that he would rather be right than president. His compromises and contradictory position on slavery ensured that he was neither. Henry Clay inherited slaves as a young child, and he continued to own slaves throughout his life. However, in the 1790s, he adopted anti-slavery views under the influence of his mentor, founding father George Wythe, who emancipated his own human property. Like most of his contemporaries, Clay was not a racial egalitarian and never called for the immediate abolition of slavery, but he viewed slavery as a grievous wrong to the slave and spoke in favor of equal treatment for free blacks. Early in his career, Clay favored gradual emancipation in both Kentucky and Missouri, but each state rejected plans that would have provided for gradual emancipation. Clay continued to support gradual emancipation throughout his career and published an open letter in 1849 calling for gradual emancipation in Kentucky, though he qualified this view by stating he would only support emancipation if it included a plan for colonizing free blacks outside of the state. In 1816, Henry Clay helped establish the American Colonization Society, as we had just discussed, which was a group that wanted to establish a colony for free American blacks in Africa. Henry Clay's support for colonization reflected his belief that a multiracial society was ultimately unworkable both for whites and free blacks. Under Clay's plan, all enslaved children born after 1860 would be freed at the age of 25. At that time, they were to work for 3 years in order to finance their own importation. During this period, enslavers could still sell or mortgage their human property. Some abolitionists did not view this plan favorably. In 1849, Frederick Douglass denounced this plan in a speech to the New England Anti-Slavery Society. He objected to the 3 years when the enslaved were in jeopardy, as they were still held as property. Later in his career, Henry Clay became increasingly concerned about abolitionism, remarking that ultraism of the South on the one hand and the ultraism of abolition on the other represented the greatest threat to the Union. Nonetheless, he consistently defended the right of abolitionists to send materials through the mail and opposed the gag rule, which limited congressional debate on slavery. On his 600-acre plantation, there were 122 enslaved people that were held over the course of his life. Clay's status as a slave owner and his anti-slavery views occasionally led to conflicts in his political career. Henry Clay considered himself to be a good master. However, biographer James C. Clotter concludes that Clay took actions such as keeping families together to mitigate the harshness of slavery. However, showing the opposite in his treatment of the family of Lewis Hayden. Clotter also states that there is no evidence that Clay ever had sex with any of his slaves. Other sources state quite the contrary of his punitive and sexual practices. In 1844, Henry Clay's wife discovered that he was having relations with the yellow girl that attended his poultry and fowls. The young woman and her children were then sent to Louisiana to be sold. While in Washington, D.C., Henry Clay acquired an octoroon to serve as concubine. Phoebe Moore, age 16, was purchased by Henry Clay from his wife's cousin, Senator Thomas Hart Benton, according to her obituary in the New Orleans Times. When he was in Washington, she resided with Clay in his Washington home and bore him 2 children. After he emancipated her, she moved to Memphis, Tennessee. Regarding keeping families together, Henry Clay applied the opposite to the family of Lewis Hayden. In about 1836, Henry Clay had enslaved mother Esther Harvey and her son sold south. They were the family of Lewis Hayden, a waiter at the upscale Phoenix Hotel. In about 1842, Hayden was threatened also by Clay with the sale of his second wife, Harriet Bell Hayden, and her son Joseph, who he had adopted. Hayden secured the aid of Vermont resident Delia Webster and Oberlin College student Reverend Calvin Fairbank through the assistance of John Mifflin, AME minister and resident over Oberlin, Ohio. They crafted a successful escape plan via the Underground Railroad through Maysville, Kentucky, across the Ohio River to the Free States of Ohio and Michigan. The Haydens became residents of Ontario, Canada. On January 4th of 1845, Webster received a sentence of 2 years hard labor for her part in the escape, but she was pardoned on February 24th of 1845. Another example is Lewis Richardson, Clay's self-emancipated slave. He gave a speech that belies Clay's self-betrayal as a good master. Richardson had been enslaved at Ashland for 20 years, and after a beating escaped via the Underground Railroad in January of 1846. By May of that year, Richardson was also living in Ontario. In a speech he gave at Union Chapel there, he told not only of continual sparse food and lack of warm clothing, but of 150 lashes from overseer Ambrose Bryce for the offense of being an hour late returning from a visit to his wife. Bryce later denied this claim, stating it was 16 lashes, and the offense was drunkenness. Clay was away on business when this occurred. In 1829, Charlotte Depew, who was enslaved by Clay, sued for her freedom while visiting relatives in Maryland. Depew's attorney gained an order from the court for her to remain in Washington until the case was settled. And she worked for wages for 18 months for Martin Van Buren, Clay's successor as Secretary of State. The case embarrassed Clay politically and personally, but he ultimately prevailed in court. And after winning the case, Clay sent Depew to New Orleans, causing her to be away from her own family, but he later freed Depew and 2 of her children. Aaron Depew, Charlotte's husband, was ordered by Clay to be whipped at the behest of Clay's wife, Lucretia. Depew's infraction was a late return as Lucretia's carriage driver. The overseer attempted the whipping, but Depew managed to wrest the whip away and began beating the overseer. He was not freed at the time of Clay's death, but became freed after Civil War. Clay himself wrote, "Here in Kentucky, slavery is in its most mitigated form, but it's still slavery." Clay's will provided for the gradual emancipation of the slaves he held at the time of his death in 1852. Aaron Depew was an exception. Clay also stipulated that several of those slaves were bequeathed to his son, John. So as you can see, Henry Clay, it was, really, it was kind of a hypocritical view with slavery with him. In my opinion, at least, he said that slavery was bad. However, he didn't agree or didn't think that races should be equal and that freed blacks and whites couldn't basically live in harmony, in equality in the United States. So it was just, he flip-flopped a lot on this. So it wasn't overly good in my opinion, his view on it, and obviously his relationship with slavery. One of the least known of Henry Clay's accomplishments is he had influence on a young Kentuckian. And that Kentuckian ended up being none other than Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln once told a sculptor carving his likeness that he almost worshipped Henry Clay. Although Lincoln is not known to have ever met Clay, there can be little doubt of the profound impact Clay had on him. For Lincoln, Clay was his Beau ideal of a statesman, a political role model to be emulated and supported. In July 6th of 1852, Abraham Lincoln actually gave a eulogy in Springfield, Illinois on Henry Clay. And I'm going to read you the last line of that eulogy that was written and delivered by Abraham Lincoln. "But Henry Clay is dead. His long and eventful life is closed. Our country is prosperous and powerful, but could it have been quite all it has been and is to be without Henry Clay? Such a man the times have demanded, and such in the providence of God was given us. But he is gone. Let us strive to deserve, as far as mortals may, the continued care of divine providence, trusting that, in future national emergencies, he will not fail to provide us the instruments of safety and security." At the moment Henry Clay lay dying in Washington, he must have looked back upon his career as lawyer, state representative, United States Senator, Congressman, Speaker of the House, a peace commissioner, Secretary of State, on the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise Tariff Bill revision in 1833, the American system, his American system, the Texas question, and the Compromise of 1850, his greatest victory. Through the bitter, raw political years in American history, Henry Clay prevailed. Even in the face of great family tragedy, he prevailed. Contemporaries branded him with numerous political epithets, but these he survived. Few American politicians could claim so many victories or engage in so many gambles and still claim an exalted place in political history. Perhaps Henry Clay's greatest honor was the post-mortem one he received when a great majority of American historians honored him as having been one of the greatest United States senators. The name of Henry Clay was stamped deeply on the American political scene during his lifetime, but perhaps his true greatness has emerged since in the overflowing stream of impressive monographs and biographies of his life and achievements. In his image is reflected that of a young republic. Mississippi Senator Henry S. Foote stated that had there been one such man in the Congress of the United States as Henry Clay in 1860 to 1861, there would, I feel sure, have been no Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was a great admirer of Clay, saying he was my ideal of a great man. Henry Clay is generally regarded as one of the important political figures of his era. Most historians would tell you that Clay is considered one of the most influential speakers in the history of the House. There have been many monuments and memorials erected and dedicated in the honor of Henry Clay. And the reality is that Henry Clay was a very important, influential man. Noting Clay's influence over the United States in the last 3 decades of his life, biographer James Clotter writes that perhaps posterity should no longer call it the Jacksonian era and instead term it the Clay era. Perhaps John C. Calhoun had some of the language in mind when setting a memorable definition for the nature of friendship among senators. Calhoun observed, "I don't like Henry Clay. He is a bad man, an imposter, a creator of wicked schemes. I would not speak to him, but, by God, I love him." In December of 1851, at the age of 74, with his health declining, Henry Clay announced that he would resign from the Senate the following September. Clay never recovered from his illnesses and died of tuberculosis at 75 years old in his room at the National Hotel in Washington, D.C. on June 29th of 1852. Henry Clay was the first person to lie in state in the United States Capitol Rotunda. Henry Clay's headstone at the Lexington Cemetery in Lexington, Kentucky reads, "I know no north, no south, no east, no west." Hymn writer Fanny Crosby penned this line of lament on Clay's death: "Sleep on, O statesman, sleep, within thy hallowed tomb, where pearly streamlets glide, and summer roses bloom." Ladies and gentlemen, Henry Clay. I leave you with images of Henry Clay's tomb in Lexington, Kentucky at the Lexington Cemetery. His tomb, as you see from these photos, these are my photos, are magnificent. Truly spectacular. Absolutely amazing tomb. In, believe it or not, one of my favorite cemeteries in the entire country, Lexington Cemetery in Lexington, Kentucky. I love it. Beautiful cemetery. So I leave you with my images, my visit to Henry Clay's tomb. I've been there a couple of times. Just fascinating, wonderful stuff. I also leave you with some images on the screen of Ashland, Henry Clay's home estate there in Kentucky. These are not my photos. They were taken by my friend Andy Peter, who is a photographer and does a wonderful, magnificent job, as you see. And if you actually Google Feral Historian WordPress, you'll actually see Andy's blog and things that he writes. Very, very magnificent photographer, historian, very interesting guy, a good friend of mine. So I've never been inside Ashland, to be honest with all of you. I've been obviously to Kentucky, but I've never, unfortunately, had the time to go over to Ashland, but Andy has, and he's been inside, and that's the photos you're seeing. Those are credit to Andy Peter, not myself. But the grave, the tomb photos, those are all from me. Those are all ones I've taken of Henry Clay's tomb. So there you go, guys. Like I said, part 2 would be a little long, but I hope you enjoyed it, learning about the life, the legacy, the presidential election losses of the great statesman, the great compromiser, Henry Clay. Thanks so much for everything, guys. Stay tuned. Next week, we will obviously release a new video about another presidential election loser, someone who ran and lost. But I'm not going to ever tell you who it is. I'm going to leave it as a surprise each week. So you have to stay tuned to find out who we're going to go over and who the subject is. So thanks again, guys. See you next week. Bye-bye now.